this series of presentations, I'm going to be dealing with the topic of biblical models of pastoral ministry. Now, with many of the other presenters in your introduction to pastoral ministry subject, you will have been covering many topics. This one specifically is focusing back to biblical models. And so you'll see there on the roadmap on screen what they really do. Introduction, that's just a bit of a fun interaction. But then tracing the outline, looking at pastoral theology, a perspective at least, Old Testament models, New Testament, a guy by the name of Tidball, whose perspective we'll borrow. And then I want to look at one particular modern role, and that is common to most of us in one way or another, as we'll find out, being a second in charge. And I'm putting the qualifier in there, hopefully a good second in charge, and I hope the couple of points that I'm able to give you in that one will actually help that to be a reality. Okay, so what they do. And the first one, coming from my background, I'm using some pickies that I picked up a while ago, looking at what missionaries do, and it depends on who's asking. So, cameo number one, what the supporters think we are doing as missionaries, on a very high pedestal, world at our feet, preaching the gospel and people repenting in the periphery. What the local people think we're doing, that's assuming we are coming from a different economic background. They think we are Mr., Mrs., Miss Moneybags, unless of course you're going to missionary to Japan, in which case they wonder why you're coming from such a poor country, Australia. What the secular world think we're doing, and they're thinking the Crusades from the Middle Ages, and then rather a sad cameo for the conclusion, what we're actually doing, we are talking about a wonderful message, and the person listening who's not understanding the language that we're speaking and we're not understanding their language, they think we're talking about a bird and we're talking about something else. Now, I hope that's only for the first few weeks of that missionary's time on field. I hope they learn language and culture and all of the above. Okay, so using that, though, as a perspective, I'd now like you, in your mind, to come on a journey with me. Your journey, if you don't mind. And that is, what do Alpha Crucis college graduates do? And we've got some possible scenarios that I want you to think about for a moment. Now, this is just to get us thinking. There's no right, wrong answers here, and you don't even have to fill in the blanks. But what my friends think I do, which may be quite different from what my family thinks I do, which may be quite different from what society thinks I do, which may be quite different from what my Alpha Crucis classmates think I do, and then what I think I do, but then what I really do. And it is worth spending some time thinking through all of those things, because we can be pushed by other people's perspectives. We can be pushed by artificial perspectives of our own. And by thinking about that, it helps us to have a realistic view of the pastoral ministry that we will be getting involved in, at least that we're getting trained for, and therefore probably getting involved in as we go forward. Now, I remember reading an article a few years ago of people who were interviewed after they had graduated from college and gone into ministry. And they were expressing a lot of frustration because what they were doing in ministry was so different from what they thought they got trained for. I would not like that to happen for you. Therefore, a bit of your own reality check as you think this through, and as we look at biblical models, as we look at that one topic at the end about an area of practical outworking, hopefully even just spending a few minutes on a grid like that could be useful. Okay, so tracing the outlines. Pastoral theology, we need to remind ourselves, is a young field of study. Now, that's a relative term, but highlighting the point, though, that theology theology itself is a much older field of study, whereas applying the same sort of lenses to pastoral ministry is a much younger field of study. So latter part of the 19th century, but especially post-World War II, is the era that this has had the most research, the most study, the most writing, the most reflection, the most articles, and therefore the most resources available for you. However, in the process, this was often influenced by the theology aspect of that study. So pastoral theology, okay, where's the emphasis, the pastoral or theology? And theology tended to carry the day somewhat. But there is another way of looking at this same body of material, and that is pastoral ministry as a field of study. And if we've said that pastoral theology is a young field of study, pastoral ministry as a field of study is even younger. And while related to pastoral theology, uses a different emphasis. And that emphasis is much more suited to the ethos and motivation of Pentecostal charismatic churches, because it emphasizes the doing of ministry, not just the study of ministry. And that fits within our world a lot more, and Alpha Crucis College fits within those Pentecostal charismatic churches. Now, it doesn't mean to say that we don't bridge into all of these other fields, but just reminding ourselves where our comfort zone is. And therefore, pastoral theology, yes, pastoral ministry as a field of study, even more so. Now, I don't know what time of day it is where you are as you're looking at this particular chart, but if it's too early in the morning or too late at night and your eyes are having difficulty, the spider's web between these two columns may not do a lot of good for your eyes, but it helps to see the theoretical emphases of the column on the left, but then the practical outworking of it on the side, on the right. And this is where Helpner is helping us to see the way that Christian faith, Christian life, and theology in general all combine to equip us for the ministry that God has called us to. Now, tracing the outlines. We've already said that pastoral theology is a young field of study. To understand this, we need to look at the broader history of pastoral care for God's people and ask the question behind the scenes about the motifs, not motive, motive metaphors of care that are present. And as we do come to understand those motives, to then ask the question if those main motives that we have used, the motifs, the metaphors, whether they are appropriate for us to understand pastoral ministry, and whether not only are they appropriate, but whether they're adequate. And if they're not appropriate, how could we adjust them? If they're not adequate, how could we advance them? So these are all questions worth asking while we're thinking, what does the Bible have to say about pastoral ministry? And so this would be a really good set of questions to reflect on in your Moodle class forum, where you can log in and post your own thoughts and pop the question up there and see what others want to contribute to that. That would be a great informal activity that you could engage in, looking at those motives and metaphors, appropriate, adequate, and etc. So, catch you again in a moment, and we'll continue with the next presentation. As we look at the title of this next slide, there's one really important thing to see, and that is, if I spelt out Old Testament rather than just writing OT, the line would become too long, and therefore profound statement. Our title is tracing OT outlines of pastoral ministry. Excuse the trivia, it's okay. It is after lunch and we're having a good time here. But getting down to what we do want to talk about right now, who would you think of as Old Testament models of pastoral ministry and pastoral care? Now notice I'm not saying what, I'm saying who. Who would you think of as Old Testament models of pastoral care, pastoral ministry and pastoral care? Or to focus that, what would be some, or who would be some of our heroes that we would look at and say, oh, maybe this one, maybe that one. Key players in the Old Testament spectrum who we could think of as being models somehow of pastoral ministry, and maybe not just pastoral ministry, but pastoral care. So now I'm popping a few names on screen. Was Abraham a pastor? Was Moses a pastor? Was David a pastor? Were the Levites pastors? And we'll fan some of those questions out in just a moment and see what we would find out when we do look at our Bibles with those as questions. So as we continue to trace these Old Testament outlines, asking the question now, was Moses a pastor? And by the way, I've sometimes heard people refer to him as a pastor. But when David, in 1 Chronicles chapter 23, is making some sort of an evaluative statement about Moses, David, is not noting Moses as a pastor as such. And I would add, and no, he was not pastor of the Israelites, because pastor is a role somewhat unique to New Testament church rather than Old Testament society. And Moses, you'll see from our bullet points, was the national leader of the Israelites for a specific purpose, namely freeing them from Egypt and getting them to Canaan. He carried an incredible role, and every time I read the stories of Moses all over again, I never cease to be amazed at him as a person. When you think through the phases of his life, all the way from the River Nile, all the way to overlooking the land of Canaan, and his 40 years in the wilderness looking after sheep in the meantime, and just so many factors that make his life so fascinating, interesting, and him as a person, such a model to be followed. But the one thing he was not is a pastor. Are there leadership lessons we can learn from him? Oh, yeah. Are there personal lessons we can learn from him? Oh, yeah. But as far as Moses showing us how to be the pastor of a church, that isn't implied there in the data, as far as I'm concerned. Was David a pastor? And again, I'm suggesting the answer is no. There were people around David. Gad, for example, being a classic example, is referred to in contemporary English version as being one of David's prophets. But Message version refers to him as one of David's pastors. American Standard Version refers to Gad as David's seer. So Eugene Peterson in Message version uses the word pastor, but not of David, but rather of Gad in his service to David. Okay, so therefore maybe the Levites were pastors because they were engaged in the religious side of the nation of Israel. And 1 Chronicles 23 spells out their roles somewhat, and we find that the Levites were organized for the aspects of worship, and all of what they did was to support Aaron's descendants, and Aaron's descendants were carrying out the ritualized religious roles meant to be a part of the spiritual journey of the people of Israel. But the Levites themselves, they were organized to be supportive of Aaron and their descendants. So again, there's no direct analogy for pastoral roles of today with the roles of the Aaronite priests or the Levites, there's no direct connection for us to make that linkage. But it is worthwhile thinking through pastoral care as it was outworked in those Old Testament communities. So in the Old Testament communities, how was pastoral care outworked? Well, it wasn't outworked around church, but yes, we've already said there was the ritual side of life led by the Aaron and his sons, the priesthood, whether through the tabernacle, whether through the temple. Then in the Jewish exilic communities, there was unique prophetic dimensions, prophets anointed by God, directed by God to care for the people of Israel while they were in exile away from the land of Israel. And then in the intertestamental Jewish communities, we also see pastoral care happening, and this was happening in lots of different ways. The Pharisees, with their pastoral care, even thinking outside of Israelites themselves, Jews themselves. Jesus it was who said of the Pharisees, "You cross land and sea to make a single follower," who then would have been thought of as a proselyte Jew. So they were quite involved. In the New Testament communities as well, we see different elements of pastoral ministry, pastoral care, led by the apostles, outworked in many ways, and they become models for us. But then also, as we look at the pre-modern faith community, down through the centuries, we see pastoral care worked out in lots of different ways, and all of those become models worth considering as we go forward. Now, we have a heading, Student Reflection Time, New Testament. And what I would like you to do, just take a moment after I pop the headings up on this slide, take a moment to actually pause and think about your answers to the questions that are posed. Think about it a bit, and then I will then follow it up with presentation material. Before we continue, what are some guidelines for the role and functions of pastor and church leader that you can identify from the you can identify in the New Testament or from the New Testament? And to stimulate that question, here are the names of some people, stories from the New Testament. So, what guidelines for the roles and functions of a pastor and church leader can we identify from the life of Jesus, or from the book of Acts, or from the Apostle Paul, or from the Apostle Peter, from James, from Luke, from the book of Hebrews? It really is worth taking a moment to kick back and think about these before we do it in lecture format, because I'm assuming for most of you familiar with the Gospels, other New Testament writings, you would regard many of these entities that I've listed, you'd probably regard them as your close friends. You spent significant time with them. And to ask them this question, what guidelines for the roles and functions of a pastor and church leader have you got to tell me? It would be worth doing that for a few minutes before we just jump into the lecture. And assuming you have done that, I'm continuing with the lecture right now. Pastoring approaches in the New Testament. And I'm going to be picking up some of those names that we've just been looking at. So beginning with Jesus, one of the things that I think we in the modern world need to put right to the top of our list is that of miracles. I'm highlighting this in a few ways. First of all, in a westernized society where, thinking of Australia, which is where I am right at the moment, where we've got an incredible medical system, research into diseases and things is taking place all the time, new cures are being found, new medical procedures. It's easy to let the miraculous slip and not being proactive in caring for people by actually intentionally praying for God to intervene in their lives by virtue of miracles. And there's another influence factor there as well, and that is in our studies. As we continue to dig into the resources and reference material that we dig into, a lot of that is actually written by non-Pentecostals, and therefore miracles would not be recorded in that article, in that book, in that chapter. The people who will bring it in will be us as Pentecostals and Charismatic. And therefore I'm highlighting that because unless we do, who will? So I think that is one really key aspect of care and action pastorally that Jesus sets out for us. Also, another aspect of his pastoral ministry, quote unquote, his care for people, is his ministry was incredibly focused. And the background of that is his actual ministry was providing salvation for the whole world. That was his real ministry. So what did he do in the meantime? And this is why I'm saying it was focused, because you'll recall the Canaanite woman coming to Jesus, my daughter, demon possessed, please help, please help. I came to the disciples, they wouldn't try to help me. Jesus, you help me. No, it's not right that I should take the children's food and give it to dogs. Yeah, that's fine. Let the dogs eat the crumbs from the table. And Jesus then, somewhat forced by her faith, if nothing else, responded to her faith and saw that miracle occur. But also, so that's the focused element, willing to even offend that person because of the focus of his ministry. But then we also see the statement that the disciples baptized with water, but not Jesus himself, because John the Baptist made the point that Jesus was going to come and he would bring baptism with the Spirit. And so Jesus wasn't baptizing in water himself, even though the disciples were. He had a role, and he was very focused on that particular role. And then expanding, or continuing the list about Jesus, we see Jesus commissioning Peter. And there was two elements to this that were unique, and we see some of this reflected in Peter in a little while, where in Matthew 16, Jesus commissioned Peter to be able to allow or disallow things as life was going forward into church, as it eventually became. The things that you allow on earth will be allowed in heaven. The things you disallow on earth will be disallowed in heaven. And we see that across in the book of Acts, where it was Peter allowing the gospel to go to Cornelius's house, the Gentile, that really opened the door for the gospel to really be available to Gentiles. It was the Apostle Peter in Acts 15 allowing Gentile people to come to faith through their own culture, not having to convert first to Jewish culture. So we see this allow, disallow function, and that's a topic we could spend a lot of time on. I'm going to leave it there with just those summary statements, but that was one part of Jesus' commission to Peter. And then he also, after the resurrection, commissioned him to feed my sheep. And we see this outworked in the life of Peter in a unique way as well. Also, we see from Jesus the ecclesia, the called out ones, the church. In cases of conflict, Matthew 18 was another part of pastoral leadership ministry that we see through the life of Jesus. And then also Jesus washing the disciples' feet, which he said in John 13, I've done this because there was lessons in this you needed to know for your leadership roles, your ministry roles, for your church roles. And so his washing the disciples' feet is an incredibly important element of what we learn from Jesus. And it's Crabill's book, The Upside Down Kingdom, that expands this out incredibly, helping us to see that in a way, Jesus washing the disciples' feet was probably the major telltale mark of what is real Christianity. Quite fascinating. Jesus also initiated communion, the Lord's Supper. He gave us the Great Commission, and as part of the Great Commission, highlighted water baptism, baptism as initiation into this new element of life that today we refer to as the church. And so I'll leave our conversation about Jesus there. In a moment, we'll pick up some of the other characters from the New Testament and what we find to lead us and guide us as leaders in church, out of church, Christian leaders, and influence people even today. The book of Acts, where so much is going on, is very fertile for us while we start thinking about models for leadership in the church these days. So first of all, we see in Acts chapter 2 and following, water baptism was a key part of bringing people into an external expression of people's relationship with God through Christ. And in those days, baptism was known in other religions as well, and it was an initiation ceremony. And when we realize that's what it was, it really carries very strong imagery back into people coming into life in Christ, being initiated into that new community. And coming out of that then is the community of believers. We see that in the book of Acts, particularly in the early chapters. There was no one that had need because each shared with the other. That element of community that was incredibly strong there in the early chapters of the book of Acts. Another element that we find as the church was continuing to grow in Acts chapter 6, there was, as the Christians were looking after the underprivileged amongst their numbers, there was a complaint that some groups were being looked after more than others. And the apostles responded with this very intriguing and important statement, and that is, we must give ourselves to the Word of God and prayer. We can't digress to wait on tables. And so they delegated that responsibility to others. And while we're talking about roles, while we're talking about functions, while we're talking about models for leadership, the very fact that in church life there can be, not everything has to be done by the pastor. Not everything has to be done by the actual pastoral team. Delegation is so important, but it needs to be done in careful and responsible ways, of course. There was also the sense in the book of Acts that the apostles, based back in Jerusalem, had a responsibility beyond just Jerusalem. So as the gospel was being taken to Samaria, Acts chapter 8, and word got back to Jerusalem, the leaders in Jerusalem sent Peter to Samaria to be a part of what was going on there, remembering that the gospel had got to Samaria because of the persecution back in Jerusalem as a result of the death of the martyrdom of Stephen. And but there was a sense of responsibility, I guess is a good word, from the leaders in Jerusalem, that they needed to have a look at, make sure that what was happening in Samaria was happening in an appropriate way. And that same oversight attitude was there with Antioch up in the north. They didn't go themselves, but they very carefully chose a person who they would send on their behalf, that person being Joseph. And at that point you think I'm reading the wrong script, but no, I'm using his real name rather than Barnabas, his nickname. And yeah, you're right, it was Barnabas. And so they sent Barnabas to Antioch to oversight what was going on there, because they felt responsible, obviously. And then by the time we get to Acts chapter 15, that oversight sense was continuing, because by this time Paul had been ministering extensively in the Gentile world, and he had been allowing Gentiles to come to faith in Jesus in their own environment without having to become proselyte Jews first. And the Jews, especially the Judaizers as they were known, they insisted that everyone had to become proselyte Jewish converts first. Then and only then could they become followers of Jesus, because that was the experience that the Jewish believers had had. They were Jews, now they had become believers in Jesus. So they assumed that everyone had to be Jew, become follower of Jesus. And so the church, the apostles especially, took oversight of that and called for the Council of Jerusalem, Acts 15. And so they felt responsible for the whole church movement, not just local situations. And then it is interesting, just as an aside on this, and to get the answer for this one, by the way, you'll need to make a booking in heaven to get this question answered, because F.F. Bruce, in his book, Men and Movements of the Primitive Church, he does not answer it, but he raises the interesting question of how come in Acts chapter 8 everyone had to leave Jerusalem because of the persecution, but the apostles were able to stay in Jerusalem. A fascinating question that is worth considerable thinking, and having done the considerable thinking, I think you'll be like me and say, I really don't know, but it's quite amazing anyway. And in a moment, we will continue looking at Peter, because Peter is such an important person that we can learn so much from, because of what we've already seen happen in his life, but we'll do that in just a moment. Welcome back, and we are about to have a journey with Peter. Now, did you notice while I was talking about Jesus' ministry, I talked about various things that Jesus commissioned Peter for. So it's interesting then to look at Peter's life, including his writings, and to see what continuity we see there, plus what other lessons we learn from Peter directly. So we've already referred to the fact that in Matthew 16:19, what you prohibit, what you permit, using Good News Bible terminology, that was already there. And that was a unique role given to Peter by Jesus himself. And as I said, at that time, In Acts 2, the gospel was allowed by Peter to go to the prepared Jews. He was the preacher on the day of Pentecost. Acts 10, the gospel was allowed to go to the Gentiles, namely to Cornelius' household. Acts 15, Peter confirmed his allowing of the gospel to go to the Gentiles. So it's interesting to see the way that allowed, disallowed, prohibit, permit element of his life worked out. But also, remember we said that Jesus said that Peter was given the role of feed my sheep. And in 1 Peter 5, we see Peter using shepherding terminology in very meaningful ways, seeing himself as an under-shepherd, under the great shepherd. This is terminology that we don't get from the others particularly, but for Peter this was obviously a statement that impacted him. He never got away from it. That sense of being commissioned by Jesus to shepherd, care for his sheep, shepherd his sheep. And as part of that, 1 Peter chapter 5, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God. Cast your care on him because he cares for you. But at the same time, beware. Satan, like a roaring lion, is there seeking who he is able to devour. So there's good advice from the under-shepherd, and particularly caring for those of us who are under-shepherds under Peter, who is under-shepherd under Jesus, and highlighting that shepherding role that we have as pastors, as leaders, as people of influence within the Christian sphere. There is this unique role of shepherding that we need to keep in mind. And especially when we put that back into shepherding as it was known back in New Testament times. See, we as Aussies, we get a very different, we carry with ourselves a very different view of sheep and shepherding, in the sense that for us, you round up sheep with a helicopter and or sheepdogs. You have the road train ready. You have the ship at the port ready for live sheep export, and we're talking how many sheep per load, how many sheep per property. No personal identification with the sheep at all. Whereas in the New Testament era, those little micro herds that they had, where basically every sheep was known by name, their characteristics understood and cared for very personally. And that's the imagery that Peter is bringing across. And I think it is something that we need to hold in creative tension in the modern world, where in the modern world we are seeing multiple churches of incredible size compared with any other time in history, and those churches require incredibly well-run management to be able to function and fulfill their God-given responsibility and to do well in the roles and the tasks that God has given them to do. But the danger then is for that to then slide across to become only management driven rather than having that shepherding element that's there. And I really thank God for some of the churches that I've had a bit to do with, larger churches, who've worked incredibly hard to ensure that there is a shepherding element to even large church, but shepherding element to make sure that that is happening even to the least of these. A really important point, in fact. Now, as a little interlude, ladies and gentlemen, as we go along, let me read you something. The heading on this document, when I picked it up, said, "One Minister's Resume." So, let's go on a journey. One of the toughest tasks the church faces is choosing a good minister. A member of an official board undergoing this painful process finally lost patience. He'd watched the Pastoral Relations Committee reject applicant after applicant for some fault, alleged or otherwise. So he stood up and read a letter purporting to be from another applicant. Gentlemen, understanding your pulpit is vacant, I should like to apply for the position. I have many qualifications. I've been a preacher with much success and also some success as a writer. Some say I'm a good organiser. I've been a leader most places I've been. I'm over 50 years of age. I've never preached in one place for more than 3 years. In some places I've left town after my work caused riots and disturbances. I must admit I've been in jail 3 or 4 times, but not because of any real wrongdoing. My health is not too good, though I still get a great deal done. The churches I've preached in have been small, though located in several large cities. I've not gotten along well with religious leaders in towns where I've preached. In fact, some have threatened me and even attacked me physically. I'm not too good at keeping records. I've been known to forget whom I've baptized. However, if you can use me, I will do my best. The board member looked over the committee. Well, what do you think? Shall we call him? He asked. The church folks were aghast. Call an unhealthy, troublemaking, absent-minded ex-jailbird? Was the board member crazy? Who signed the application? Who had such colossal nerve? The board member eyed them all keenly before he answered, It's signed the Apostle Paul. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the next person we want to spend some time looking at, and we will do that in just a moment. So looking forward to our journey with the Apostle Paul. As we continue to look at pastoring approaches in the New Testament, there's some really interesting and important things that we discover from the Apostle Paul. I'm going to focus on one of these to start with and then expand from there, where we discover in Acts 14 verse 23. Now let's put this in context before I even read it. This is Paul's first ministry journey. He and Barnabas have arrived on the shore of Asia Minor. They have then gone north through a series of towns preaching the gospel. In some of these towns, people responded to the gospel, and now they're coming south again. So that's the geography of what's going on. And as they're coming south again, Acts 14:23, in each church, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, Antioch, Pisidia, they appointed elders. My emphasis, they appointed elders. And with prayer and fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. Okay, now, that statement, they appointed elders, what would be our equivalent term for elders in this context? And the answer is pastors, leaders, a range of terms we could use. But in our parlance, it would be pastors is what would be the equivalent at that point. And so they appointed them, and then with prayers and fasting, they commended them to the Lord. Now there's a slight spelling error there. I'm sure you're picking it up, because in the modern world it would be with prayers and F-E-A-S-T-I-N-G, with prayers and feasting, not prayers and fasting. But anyway, slight digression from the text there. They commended them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. Now, commending them to the Lord also meant that they were about to take a walk. They themselves were leaving. They had appointed they'd started the churches going north, coming south. They'd appointed leaders, prayer, fasting, commended them to the Lord as they then were moving on. So a key point that goes right over our head while we are just reading those words, though, is what was meant by the term appointed elders. And in order to get a feel of this, I'm using Strong's Concordance inserted here, and the word King James Version is actually ordained. When they had ordained elders, and that word ordained, if you can really read the fine print, and you probably can't, so you don't need to because then you can see the big font, it's word G5500, and then you can't see the fine print at the bottom anyway, so let me read it for you. That word is a compound of this word and that word, but it means to be a hand reacher or a voter, raising the hand. That is, to select, to appoint, to choose, ordain. And it seems to imply, and this is worth noticing because it was relevant to that era, it's relevant to many places around the world today, but it would not be considered normative in the churches that most of us are a part of. So what they were doing, they were in this radical church planting process of starting churches from nothing and building enough into that church so that that church could start meeting and having gatherings, but with no appointed leaders at this stage. Then, on return, coming south, they, now with the congregation indicating by show of hand, there was a sense of who are the leaders that God is calling to be these leaders. Let's appoint the God-called people. Now, there's a radicalness to the style of church and the style of church planting that is talked about here that has virtually no current equivalent in the Western church. But in many other parts of the world, church planting is happening at this sort of rate, and therefore these models do have significance in those situations. And so there's a lesson we can learn here. Now, as I go to the next slide, you'll see this outworked. First of all, that same passage there. But then by the time we pick up Paul's letter to Timothy, and especially Paul's letter to Titus, he's writing to Timothy, chapter 3, verses 1 to 13, talking to Timothy about appointing elders. So what's implied? It's implied that churches are being planted, leaders are yet to be appointed. And in Titus, Paul talking to Titus about Crete, where he'd sent him, he said, I have sent you to Crete in order to appoint leaders. So in other words, Crete must have been a situation like Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, Antioch, and Pisidia. Churches had been started, but without leaders formally appointed. Now, in embedded societies, in societies very much used to operating as a community, which is not the Western world, the cultures that I've had a lot to do with, my time in Papua New Guinea, but also consultancy into lots of other societies, people are much more willing and able to just do things together without having to have appointed leaders. And then appointed leaders, as they are appointed according to people's sense that they are the ideal leaders for that situation. So it's interesting to see this construct that Paul had put in place, which gave him this radical ability for church planting, a radical structural ability for dynamic church planting. Now also, feeding into all of that, Paul writing, Ephesians 4, the ministry gifts of Christ. So this is part of not Paul's idea, this was God's idea, but Paul documenting it for us to understand the gifts, the structures, the roles of people uniquely gifted by God to equip believers for the work of the ministry. And then in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, the gifts of the Spirit, different from ministry gifts of Christ, by which pastoral ministry again gets worked out. So very worthwhile looking at that. And then for the last reference that I'll look at as far as Paul is concerned, to actually note that writing to Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, where he says to Timothy, the things you've heard me teach in the presence of many witnesses, in other words, you were there, Tim, and so were lots of other people, you heard what I taught. Okay, those things that you heard, you pass it on to others. But those others need to be a certain group, a certain characteristic of people called faithful people. And the definition of faithful in that context is those who will pass it on to others again. And it's actually this approach that Paul used, pass it on, who will pass it on, who will pass it on, who will pass it on. That's how come we are Christians today, because that actually works. And so there's pastoral approaches that we're learning from Paul in this context, and it's well worth taking note of them because of where it takes us from there. Now, having talked about that, I'd like to read to you, or you have on screen, an abbreviated version. I'll read the slightly longer version coming from Tidball's perspective. And this is in Tidball's book, Ministry by the Book, New Testament Patterns for Pastoral Leadership. The New Testament writers set before us a number of models of ministry, each one of which is shaped by the needs of the church they were serving, and no doubt by their own individual personalities and interests as well. Each New Testament book has a lot to say about pastoral leadership, even if it is not all transparent on the surface. And by the way, I really like what Tidball writes and what he's saying in this extrapolated piece of information. His whole book is very, very helpful in this regard. The needs Matthew was addressing were not the same as those addressed by Luke, nor Jude, nor John in Revelation. And Matthew and Luke, as well as Peter, James, and Paul, were all themselves wired up by God in different ways. They all bring to bear their own backgrounds, ambitions, and passions to what they have to say in ministry. The context combined with the person of the writer gives rise to different conceptions of ministry, but notice, all under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. As a result, we discover the varying contours of New Testament pastoral leadership, a genuine diversity that brings its unity in Christ and his gospel. A really significant statement and worth taking note of in a very significant way. I'll leave you thinking about that while I get ready for the next exciting segment of our presentation. As you can see by the heading on screen, we've seemed to have moved a long way away from biblical models. That's intentional on my part, it's not just accidental. But I include this in this segment where we've been drawing concepts out of Bible. To bring this in because when it comes to outworking all of those models in our lives and in our ministry, all of us in some way, at some point, will find ourselves being in second in charge roles, 2 ICs, as they're called. And therefore, being able to be very effective in second in charge roles makes a huge difference to any organisation, in fact, but especially as we think of God's kingdom expressed through the church here on earth, people being able to effectively work in second in charge roles is really, really important. Now, when we talk about second in charge roles, we could have an interesting conversation. If you could yell back to me through the screen, what would be some examples? Okay, let me go radical for a moment. One classic example of a second in charge role is being a Christian. Because anyone who's a Christian is, by the surrender of their will, second in charge to God. We already, as Christians, have given God authority to be first in charge in our lives. So, in other words, we're not only talking roles way down the pecking order of leadership in Christian structures. Every person, even a senior pastor in that regard, or director of a CEO of a Christian organisation, they're already in a second in charge role because of their commitment to Christ. And then similarly, even those senior people are probably already in second in charge roles because probably they have leadership and governance boards and structures over them that they are accountable to anyway. So second in charge does not mean menial by any means. So keep that in mind as we go forward. But then if we're thinking about Alpha Crucis students, by the time Alpha Crucis students graduate, the majority are probably going into roles within church life, whether full-time, part-time, voluntary, paid. They're going into roles that would be considered to be second-in-charge roles. So therefore, to spend a few minutes talking about this is more than valid. So what is a youth pastor? What is an associate pastor? Implied in the terminology is the second-in-charge type role. What about a person who's leading a department in a church? There's a second-in-charge element to that, even after we get away from those macro roles that I've been describing. But the reason I'm spending time on this today is to remind us that 2IC, second-in-charge roles, are typically very challenging. And I would like to suggest it's one of the most difficult roles to fulfill. Some reasons why I suggest they're very difficult to fulfill. In order to be an effective second in charge, you need to be representing someone else. And in that regard, not just representing them, but often even making decisions on behalf of that other person. So representing them when maybe the decision that was made that you're representing isn't your decision, but you're still representing it. Or reverse of that, maybe the onus is on you to make the decision in your second in charge role, but the decision you make is not necessarily the decision you want to make. You have to be thinking through the people that I report to, what decision would they want me to be making? So that's a really difficult role to be in. And I'm just to encourage us, because I'm always a very encouraging sort of a person, just to remind us all that a second in charge role is more likely to get kicks than kudos. Because what's the likelihood of us representing someone the way they absolutely want to be represented? What's the likelihood of us always making the decisions that the other person would want us to make on their behalf? It can fall over. And therefore, do be aware that if the kicks rather than the kudos happens to you, okay, that's somewhat normal for the role, and we have to learn how to process it. And yet at the same time, by the time we think through, well, how to handle a 2IC role, we can minimise some of those dangers and maximise some of the strengths that are implied there. One of the ways we help ourselves is by identifying some danger modes. Let me pop them up on screen here and let's have a quick look. So by robot mode, what I'm referring to is, okay, I've been appointed to a second in charge role. I don't want to make any mistakes. Because I don't want to make any mistakes, therefore, I don't want to actually make decisions myself. I will simply do what I am told. When I am told, I will do. If I'm not told, I will not do. When I am told, I will do what I'm told, even if it seems to me that the what I'm told is crazy anyway. I will not comment because I was told the buck will stop with someone else. That's the robot mode. Now, is a second in charge person engaged just to be robotic? Or is the thought that they're actually getting a person who would be a genuine contributor? I think they would hope to get a contributor. And therefore, the robot mode is a danger mode. Assuming they want a genuine contributor, then you would be learning how to contribute, but at the same time taking on risk, which would be there by being a contributor if the contribution wasn't actually highly valued. Fifth column, another danger mode. Any of you familiar with military structures? And especially Turkish military structures? But fifth column is when you have the troops, quote unquote, on parade, 4 columns, but there's a group on the side who are marching to the beat of their own drum, not actually flowing in with what needs and ought to be happening. So that's considered to be a fifth column. And when a second in charge person is like that, accumulates their own followers on the side, so that they then are able to run their own agendas, they're able to do their own thing to a certain degree, and accumulate enough influence through their followers that then they become very awkward to deal with. That is a true danger mode. Then Absalom, coming from the story of Absalom in the Old Testament, where Absalom, you recall, was very blatant in what he did. As people under his father's rule, King David, as they were waiting in the hot sun for King David to give judgment on their concerns and all that sort of thing, Absalom, with his beautiful head of hair, would walk along the line, commiserating with them all. Oh, my goodness. While my father's king, you will be standing in the sun. If only I was king, I would then be making life much more comfortable for you, etc., etc. So he wasn't just trying to get his own fifth column, his own followers. He was trying to win all the people over. And again, it's a danger mode, and we need second in charge people to notice those modes and to say, with God's help, I'm going to keep away from those. Okay, so how do we turn this into a positive? And Ted Engstrom and Ed Dayton, in their book, The Art of Management for Christian Leaders, have this chapter called Plan to Make Your Boss Successful. And they emphasize it by saying, if as a person in an organization, before God, you set your own personal definition of success to make your boss successful, then performing well in a second in charge role is very fulfilling, because you set the goal of making your boss successful. And if you're able to make your boss successful, then you are successful yourself. And can you see how that puts the second in charge role into a whole different world? So this meant, in my life, for example, while I was a missionary on the field, I had a field leader. So if I was applying this, and after I became aware of their article, which was published before 1976 as an article, and I became aware of it, I was using this as a perspective. And I found it really releasing for me. I had a director in Australia, and that person was also someone who I was saying, okay, how can I make that person successful in their role by me doing my role as a missionary very well? And so the list could go on, because seldom is it ever single reporting, often it's multi-reporting. Some key points to be able to make that happen, though. First of all, And I'll pop these up on screen and we'll just talk about them because they tie together as a cluster. First of all, to be able to do this, you need to understand your leader very well. Now, assuming your leader is a very busy person, you're probably never going to be able to sit and talk with them individually and have them instruct you about who they really are. So you have to be an astute observer. And so if that person happens to be a senior pastor and you're in an associate role or a youth leader role or something, spend all the time you possibly can listening to that person preach, share in leadership meetings, whatever, and just try and get a really good understanding of that person. All right, now next statement, always support publicly. You're second in charge. So therefore, whenever anybody's asking questions about what policy are we implementing and things like that, there is only one answer. We are implementing one policy. Always support publicly. Then, never oppose. Then, don't hesitate to ask hard questions privately. Okay, so let's assume now. Let's assume that you and that leader sometimes do have meetings in which decisions are made. So publicly, no matter whether you like the decisions that were made or not, you will be supportive of them. But also, even in the meetings where the decisions are being made, you never oppose, but you don't hesitate to ask hard questions. So in the private meetings, you ask hard questions, and during the time of decision making, you put your opinion in. You try and be a meaningful contributor. But come the point that the leader that you report to is saying, no, this is what I want to do, well, as we say in the third bullet point there, never oppose. Share your opinion openly, but never oppose, because that shows there is the respect there for the leadership structures as they are. But reverse of this, help your leader understand your heart, because your leader would not necessarily understand that your plan is to make that person successful. They need to understand that, and that means probably, given time, taking a few minutes to help them understand that. And a key safety valve statement that I will use to draw this to a conclusion, a key safety valve statement is don't necessarily plan to move beyond the second in charge position in that organisation. Because if you're in the second in charge position, but thinking to yourself, wow, I wonder how long it'll be before this person retires, I'm going to get their job. Oh, what can I do to make sure I get their job? You are going to be an incredibly uncomfortable person in that second in charge role. Maybe you're associate pastor in a church, and maybe you have it in your heart that God wants you to be a senior pastor. Okay, assume that it'll be in another church and continue to grow and get ready. And now, if God wanted it to be in that church that you're currently in and where you're associate pastor, he can make that happen, but that's up to him to make happen. It's not up to you to try and make happen. So that's where that last statement there is an incredibly important statement in the mix. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to be with you in presenting these range of topics, and with one really incredible announcement, I would like to say it's been great to be with you.